Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll continue on what the Congressman was talking about, see if we can't find some similarities of opinion in what we're talking about today. And I'd like to start with taxes, following up on what the Senator said as well. If they could bring up slide number 1, please, which is the federal income tax revenue to top income tax rate. This is a graph that shows two different things, which essentially, once they get it up, what you'll see is a red line that shows the federal revenue as a percent of GDP, and a blue line that shows the top tax rate. And as you can see, I think several of you may be familiar with this graph, over the course of the last 60-odd years, the federal government generally has taken out between 15 and 20% of GDP in tax revenues. I think the average over the course of the last 50 years is roughly 18.5%. But that during that period of time, where the government's share of the economy was relatively stable, tax rates were all over the map. This is the top marginal tax rate. What I heard just a moment ago from this panel as we went down and talked about the importance of having a mix between spending reduction and tax increases, I did not hear anybody clamoring for dramatic increases in the income tax. What I heard Dr. Stone mention actually was tax expenditures. Dr. Hassett, I've read some of your work. I think you've done some work on other fiscal consolidations that focus on tax increases on consumption as opposed to productivity. So I guess what I'm looking for, gentlemen, is some consensus here that as we look our hand over and as we look at different options that are available to us, is it fair to say that increasing the top marginal tax rates is probably the least desirable way to go forward? And I'll start with Dr. Stone.
I mentioned tax expenditures because that's something we ought to be able to agree on. Dr. Taylor is talking about how government spending has moved to a new higher level. I think that if we're realistic about the demographics in this country, about rising health care costs and the increased interest that we're now paying because of the debt incurred as a result of the recession, we're not going to be able to go back to historic levels of spending as a share of GDP without more revenues. And proposals, the President's proposals would move us back would include some increases in tax rates in the income tax that would move us back to the levels that we had in the 1990s when we really did not when we had our longest economic expansion and a balanced budget. So it's not prohibitive. Very high marginal tax rates are discouraging, but modest increases in tax rates I don't think we need to be so afraid of.
Thank you, Dr. Stone. And I'll ask, because I've heard this before, so I don't mean to interrupt, and I will give everybody a chance, but I look at the rates during the late 1990s when they were increased, and while they did represent they did lead to a slight increase in the government share of GDP, it was not marked at all. In fact, you could argue that it was actually the GDP growth that was experienced during that time that boosted the government's share of revenues. It wasn't the tax increases that actually boosted the revenues. It was the larger share of the overall economy.
Don't disagree that the strong economy helped, and importantly, those tax rates did not interfere with that very strong economy.
Thank you. Dr. Hassett?
Yes, I agree, Mr. Mulvaney. And I would add that it's especially urgent, as Mr. Camp, who's often in this room, knows, to address the fact that we're about to have the highest corporate tax on earth. And if you're wondering why it is that it's been a long time since any of us has driven down the road and seen a new plant building and growing there on the side of the road, it's because they're being located offshore to take advantage of much lower tax rates. And so I think that as we think about the fiscal consolidation, then one of the urgent design problems will be finding the space to get to the U.S. to at least as sort of middle of the OECD in terms of corporate rates if we expect growth to renew here.
Dr. Johnson?
I completely agree with the need for tax reform. I think, I don't know the details of Dr. Hassett's proposal. We may differ on that, but I think shifting away from taxing income towards taxing consumption and doing that in a way that protects relatively poor people, which certainly can be done, and it's done in other industrialized countries, that's a good idea. However, with regard to what you do about marginal tax rates within the existing code, just 2 points. First of all, I don't think anybody paid the very high rates that we had in the 1960s. There were many exemptions, as you know, many ways to manage your tax liabilities there, and I don't think anyone's proposing to go back to those levels. However, I, for one, did argue against extending the Bush tax cuts. in December. In terms of the feasible ways, credible measures you can take to bring the budget under control, if you have ways to control healthcare spending, if you have ways to end foreign wars, I'm completely open to that. I think those will be better. But given the feasible choices before us, addressing a little bit of discretionary domestic spending is not going to make a big difference. Addressing or not further extending the Bush tax cuts next time they come up in 2012 would make a first-order difference, and I think now is the time to start considering that.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask Dr. Taylor be given an opportunity to respond. Dr. Taylor.
Your chart is very important to take into account when people are thinking about raising marginal tax rates, because history shows especially at the top ends where people can avoid them or take actions not to pay them, it doesn't raise the revenues people think. But I would also add that since spending is an issue here too, that if you graph spending going way out into the future, along with what taxes will be even with a marginal tax rate increase, spending just dominates. Spending is like this exponential thing that eats you alive. And if you try to raise taxes to deal with this, it may take you up just a little bit. It's hard to notice in a graph. It's hard to notice what it'll do. And so forget that for a while. You know basically that's not the thing to do in a weak recovery. Put that off the side. Look for tax reform. Broaden the base, and reducing marginal rates is always good to try to do. But in the meantime, it really seems like it is a spending problem, as people say.
Mostly healthcare spending in the 2050 projection.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.